Chapter 11. That night, as they lay in their sleeping bags, Lindsay made a suggestion. "You've just been over your line. How about take a few days off and take a trip up to my country? There ought to be foxes on that long bay south of Squaw Lake, but I've never tried a blind set. You could show me how." Jim liked the idea. "We'll go tomorrow," he said. "Work together for a while. I don't need to start down over my line for another week." It was only about 7 miles up the squaw to Lindsay's lower camp, and the boys arrived shortly before noon. Without stopping for lunch, they pushed the two teams into the bay that made a deep indentation into the southern shore of the lake. As Lindsay had prophesied, the snow along the banks were dotted thickly with fox tracks. Jim studied the lay of the land a while and nodded. "You're right," he said. "It's a good place for a blind set. Have you got any number 4 traps along?" "Got 4 of 'em," the younger brother replied. "Right here on the sled." "All right, go over there to the edge of the lake and pull a couple armfuls of long grass." While Lindsay was gone, he chopped up a frozen fish into small bits and scraped a path clear of snow of one of the fox paths. On the bare ground, he spread the fish over an area about a foot square. Then he fastened the trap chain to the stake, which he drove solidly into the frozen earth with his axe. "Now look," he told his brother. "I'm going to set the trap and set it right on top of the fish. Then I take the grass and spread it out like this, not too thick, but thick enough to hide the trap. Sprinkle a little wet snow over it, and it'll freeze into sort of a mat. There, that's all there is to a blind set." They went on and placed the other 3 big traps at strategic points around the bay. By dusk, they were back close to Lindsay's cabin, ready for supper. It had been cloudy all afternoon, and now it snowed a little. "The wind's changing," said Jim, sniffing the air before bedtime. "This won't be much of a storm." In the morning, the air was clear, and only an inch or 2 of snow had been added to the winter's blanket. "A good day for tracking," Lindsay offered. "Let's take a swing up around Sucker Lake. I haven't been up that way to look at those traps for more than a week." "By the way, what date is this?" Jim asked. "Near as I figure, it's the 2nd of December, but I may have dropped a day somewhere along." Lindsay looked at his precious calendar. "Gee, I don't know," he frowned. "Seems to me it ought to be the 1st or the 30th of November. I marked off the days at the beginning, but after my first trip around the line, I sort of forgot about it." Jim let out a roar. "That's what comes of being fancy in the bush," he laughed. "You're worse off than I am. At least I know what month it is." They took the trail north to Sucker Lake after breakfast. The early sun slanted through the forest, its level rays gilding the spruce boughs. Chickadees chirped gaily. Swinging along over the snow with their breath rising in white clouds, the boys joked and starlarked as they went. "Have to show you how it's done in real trapping country," Lindsay bragged. "Bet I catch some fur this morning. I can feel it in my bones." Jim grinned and pointed ahead to the first cubby. "Yeah, I reckon you're right," he said. "Looks like something's in the trap." The younger boy ran forward eagerly and bent over the trap house. "Ah, shucks," Jim heard him say. When he straightened up, his face was red and sheepish. In his hand was the dangling form of a whiskey jack. "Was it fur you felt in your bones?" Jim asked innocently. "Or feathers?" Lindsay was too disgusted to reply to this thrust. He stalked ahead in silence, while Jim whistled cheerfully behind him. A quarter-mile beyond, there was a fork in the trail. "You take this one ahead," Lindsay said briefly. "I got a number 4 set over that way." Jim went on, breaking trail for the 2 teams, and a few steps brought him to a neatly built cubby. The trap was sprung, and 20 feet away he found it, where the cog had been snagged in a thicket, and in the jaws was the frozen body of a mink. Jim chuckled as he took it out and started back to the sleds. At that moment, a yell of triumph came echoing through the woods. "Hey!" Lindsay said, shouting. "Bring the rifle! I got a brush coyote!" The dogs were sniffing the air and growling. "Shut up, you Bruno," Jim ordered, "and stay here." He grabbed up the .32 from his toboggan and ran back to the place where his brother had turned off. 2 minutes later he saw the boy, club in hand, circling wearily around a big coyote caught by the forepaw. The wolf was crouched, his teeth bared. At the sight of the new enemy he made a desperate lunge and jerked the trap and its heavy cog several yards into the cover of a clump of small jackpine. "Hold still," Jim called. "I can see enough of 'em for a shot." He aimed at a patch of yellow-gray fur just behind the left shoulder and squeezed the trigger. At the crack of the rifle, the coyote gave a convulsing bound and fell in a twitching heap. "Wait," Jim warned. But Lindsay had kicked off his snowshoes and run into the thicket, brandishing his club. There was a sudden stir and a grating and a gasping snarl that ended in the metallic chop of teeth. Lindsay came tumbling backwards out of the brush. "Whew!" he breathed as he picked himself up. "Son of a gun, he tore my pants!" There was a clean slash in one knee of his Mackinaw cloth breeches, but the teeth had not broken the skin. "Reckoned he moved," said Jim. "I must have got him in the lung instead of the heart." He jerked another cartridge into the breech and drilled the wolf cleanly through the head. Lindsay got his feet on the long springs of the trap and held them down while the older boy pulled the coyote's paw free. Jim caught the animal by the hind legs and swung him over his shoulder. "He's a big one, all right. Heavy. Must weigh close to 40 pounds. They don't get lean in good rabbit year." They put the dead wolf in Lindsay's sled and went on up the trapline. The sight of the mink had filled the younger brother with glee. "Didn't I tell you?" He rubbed it in. "You're in real fur country now, my boy." After a night in the camp on Squaw Lake, they traveled on to the head of the squaw, tending the traps as they went. Slower was progress that day, for Paddy, Jim's big mongrel second dog, had cut his paw on the edge of an axe. The wound wasn't very deep, but it bled a good deal. Luckily, there was an old shirt in the cabin, which Lindsay had discarded on a previous trip, and with it they were able to bandage the foot. Along the route to Poplar Lake and Lindsay's home camp the following day, they found no fur except an ermine or two. When they got to the cabin, Pat was limping along on 3 legs, a very tired dog. It was obvious that he would have to rest if his paw was to heal properly. They spent a day there working out several short trap lines which Lindsay had set near his camp. Next morning the boys decided to leave Jim's sled and hitch up the 3 sound dogs and let the invalid ride on the toboggan. This plan was not put into execution without some difficulty. First of all, Lindsay's lead dog resented being put in second place. No sooner were they in harness than he launched a growling attack on Bruno, and the veteran police dog was in the process of giving him a sound thrashing when the boys beat them apart. Then, poor old Paddy, unused to luxury, scampered off the sled as soon as they started and limped ahead trying to take his place in the traces. Only when Jim walked beside the toboggan and talked to him reassuringly for a mile or more did he submit to being a passenger. That day, the 6th of December as Jim reckoned it, they went up Cranberry River as far as the foot of Cordingley Lake. It was the nearest either of them had been to civilization since their trip to Nakina to get the family. Lindsay had a few traps along the river, but they found nothing in them. At noon they were about to turn back when a moving speck appeared on the ice, far up by Pointed Rock. "Maybe somebody we know from town," said Lindsay. "You stay here with the dogs and I'll go meet him." It was a clear day, not too cold for comfort, and Jim sat down on the tarp that covered the loaded sled. He watched the 2 specks approach each other till they met half a mile away. For a minute or two they stood there talking. Then Lindsay turned back, waved an arm in farewell, and came down the white lake surface at a trot. "Say, what do you think?" he panted as he drew near. "That was Michael Lagarde. He said Dad came back yesterday. He's at Waba now." "Gosh," Jim beamed. "How is he? Did Michael say?" "Awfully thin, he told me, but tickled to be home and cracking jokes with everyone at the station." "How quick can we get there? I'm ready to start this minute." "We'll have to go back for my sled," said Jim. "Then you can go right across tomorrow." I'll be slower with Pat, but I'll come along as soon as I can make it back to my camp." At dawn next morning, Lindsay waved goodbye and led his team out of the cove, heading eastward towards Wabing. He would have given a prime mink skin to see his father before nightfall, as the younger boy would. However, he had been away from his home camp a week, and the injured dog had to be considered. 2 days of rest had done wonders for the big mongrel's paw. Jim put on a fresh bandage and harnessed the team and started north half an hour after his brother's departure. The dog pulled willingly, his limp hardly perceivable. They stopped for a rest at midday, then went on at an easy pace down the long, white highway of Squaw Lake. Darkness overtook them just as they reached Lindsay's lower camp. The short trip from there to Jim's main cabin was completed by noon the next day. The boy built up his fire at once, washed some clothes, and put on a pan of bread in the oven. While it baked, he let the dogs rest and visited some of his nearby traps. All but one was empty. In that he found the bones of a rabbit and a few shreds of fur left by the ravens. There was better luck awaiting him on the trail to Wabing next morning. In quick succession, he took a mink and 2 ermine from the traps near Whitefish Pond. And 3 miles further on, just as he came in sight of Porcupine Lake, he found the frozen body of a cross fox. It was his first of the season and a real catch, worth 2 or 3 times as much as a common red fox pelt. The long, soft hair was tawny underneath, shaded into gray along the back, and marked with the black cross-shaped patch on the shoulders. Jim had barely had time to put the fox in his toboggan and tie up the cover fastenings when he saw something moving on the lake ahead. It was a small herd of caribou, drifting like gray smoke across the snowy surface. Behind them trotted a single gray speck. The distance was almost half a mile, and at first glance Jim thought it was a caribou calf that had fallen behind the herd. But as he pushed through the trees for a clearer view, he muttered an exclamation. The lone follower was a timber wolf. Quickly the boy raised his rifle and steadied it in a tree crotch. It was a long shot, almost an impossible shot, but he was resolute to try it anyway. He allowed for a light wind blowing across from the south, lifted his sights to take care of the distance, and gently pressed the trigger. The crack of the rifle sounded startlingly loud in the stillness. For the space of a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then a tiny white cloud appeared for an instant right on the wolf's side. The animal leapt upward like a jack-in-the-box, whirled in the air, and started running. Jim held the rifle ready for a second shot, but the wolf offered a poor target. He was moving fast and straight away towards the wood on the opposite shore. His long bounds threw up the snow behind him in white spurts like little puffs of smoke. If the bullet had found him at all, it had certainly done no damage to his speed. The boy trudged back to the restless dogs. Well, it was a pretty fair shot at that. Couldn't have missed him by more than a foot. Say, he continued musing to himself, I wonder if he was the old big one. All alone like that. Come on, you, Bruno, mush. They crossed the trail of the caribou band a few minutes later, and Jim stopped to make a careful search in the packed snow. But the wolf had been traveling in the path beaten by the broad splay of hooves of the deer and left no recognizable sign. The brief winter daylight was beginning to wane already, and there was still 7 or 8 miles of unbroken trail to cover before night. However, Jim was beyond the trapline now, and he pushed along steadily, the dogs close to his heels. Once he felt an extra weight when he lifted his feet, and knew that Bruno was saving work by walking on the snowshoe tails. It was a trick the old lead dog had learned years before in deep, soft snow, but today the going was comparatively easy. After a sharp word from his master, the dog dropped back, a comically guilty look on his wise gray face. As dusk fell, they came down out of the high bush and crossed the eastern arm of Wabing and rounded a point into the home cove. A light glowing yellow in the cabin window. Jim let out a high-pitched whoop and broke into a run on the beaten lake trail. Yelping with joy, the dogs galloped behind him, and as they came up the path, Jim saw a great, gaunt figure silhouetted in the open door. "Hi, boy," came the strong voice of his father.